There was a moment in World War II when an empire that seemed unstoppable began moving toward a disaster it couldn't yet see. Japan had expanded across the Pacific with speed, discipline, and stunning success. Bases had fallen. Fleets had been damaged. Entire regions lived under the shadow of Japanese power. To many observers, it looked like momentum had become destiny. Japan appeared confident, prepared, and far ahead of its enemies. That confidence wasn't built on fantasy. It was built on victory. By the summer of 1942, Japanese leaders believed they could deliver another decisive blow, one that would break American strength in the Pacific and secure their own position for the future. Their target was Midway Atoll, a small location on the map, but one with enormous strategic value. The idea behind the operation was bold and precise. Strike Midway, force the United States Navy to respond, lure American carriers into battle, and destroy them. Once those carriers were gone, Japan believed the balance of power in the Pacific would shift even further in its favor. It was not just another offensive. It was meant to become the moment that locked in Japanese dominance. And on the surface, the plan carried logic. Japan had already shown how dangerous its naval air power could be. Its carrier force was experienced, aggressive, and feared. The attack on Pearl Harbor had demonstrated both daring and reach. Japanese commanders had reason to believe that another carefully executed blow could produce another overwhelming result. They expected confusion. They expected surprise. They expected the Americans to react under pressure, not prepare in silence. That expectation would prove fatal. Because what Japan did not fully understand was that the Americans were not blind. U.S. codebreakers had been working relentlessly, studying Japanese communications, identifying patterns, and piecing together intentions that Japan assumed remained hidden. Slowly, the picture became clearer. Midway was the target. The attack was coming. And with that knowledge came something priceless in war. The chance to prepare before the enemy realized surprise had already been lost. This changed everything. Instead of stumbling into a trap, the United States began building one of its own. Carriers were moved into position. Pilots prepared for a battle they knew was coming. Midway itself was reinforced and readied. On the Japanese side, the operation still looked powerful. The fleet still moved with confidence. Aircraft still launched. Orders still flowed. But beneath that surface strength, the situation had started turning. A plan built around surprise had been forced to operate in a world where surprise no longer fully existed. In war, that difference can be the line between dominance and catastrophe. The Japanese attack on Midway began with force, but almost immediately the operation started becoming more complicated than expected. The island was hit, but not neutralized as cleanly as Japanese commanders had hoped. Questions emerged about what should happen next. Should aircraft be rearmed for another strike on the island? Should they be prepared for naval attack if American ships appeared? These were not minor details. In carrier warfare, timing, deck space, fuel, bombs, torpedoes, and aircraft movement all existed inside a fragile system where a delay or change in priority could create vulnerability. And that vulnerability was growing. Japanese carriers were now operating in a tense environment filled with uncertainty. Aircraft had returned and needed to land. Others were being refueled or rearmed. Weapons were being moved. Decisions were being revised. Information was incomplete. Reports of possible American naval presence added pressure to an already complex situation. What had started as a controlled offensive was becoming unstable, and the danger was not only outside the fleet, it was now building inside it. This is what makes Midway such a devastating turning point. The battle was not won by raw force alone. It was shaped by information, timing, hesitation, and the brutal pace of carrier warfare. Japan still possessed power, but power under pressure can become fragile quickly. A carrier deck crowded with fueled aircraft and armed planes is not just a symbol of strength. Under the wrong circumstances, it becomes a disaster waiting for a spark. And that spark was getting closer. American aircraft were already in the air, searching, attacking, missing, dying, and forcing the Japanese fleet to keep reacting. Torpedo squadrons suffered terribly, but their sacrifice pulled Japanese attention downward and outward. Fighters were drawn low. Formation discipline was strained. The fleet remained dangerous, but it was no longer in perfect control. And in battles like this, perfect control is often the first thing to die. Japan still believed victory was possible, but the moment that would change the Pacific forever was only minutes away. Then the sky opened. American dive bombers arrived at the moment the Japanese carriers were most exposed. Decks were crowded. Aircraft were being serviced. Fuel and weapons were present. Defensive attention had been pulled in multiple directions. And in just a matter of minutes, the battle changed from a tense contest into a catastrophe. Bombs struck with devastating precision. Fires erupted. Explosions followed. Carriers that had represented the sharp edge of Japanese naval power were suddenly burning, broken, and dying in the sea. It is difficult to overstate the shock of that moment. For Japan, these were not ordinary ships. They were the core of offensive naval strength, symbols of expansion, skill, and confidence. They carried trained aircrews, experienced officers, and the striking power that had helped reshape the Pacific War in its early months. Losing one would have been serious. Losing several in the same battle was something else entirely. It was not simply damage, it was the collapse of momentum. And once momentum collapses in war, fear enters quickly. And the men watching it happen knew, almost instantly, that history had turned. Japan had come to Midway expecting to destroy American carriers and secure strategic advantage. Instead, it was the Japanese carrier force itself that had been shattered. The attack force that was supposed to secure the future had become the victim of the very battle it intended to control. Even then, the fighting was not instantly over. Ships still maneuvered, aircraft still searched. Men still obeyed orders and tried to strike back. But the shape of the battle had already changed. Japan was no longer advancing toward decisive victory. It was trying to survive a disaster. That reversal mattered far beyond one day. Midway did not end the war, but it transformed it. Before Midway, Japan had looked like a power moving forward, expanding outward, choosing the tempo of conflict. After Midway, that image was badly damaged. The loss of carriers, aircraft, and highly trained personnel could not be dismissed as a temporary setback. Ships can sometimes be replaced. Experienced pilots, deck crews, and combat leadership are far harder to restore, especially in the middle of a brutal war. The damage was physical, but it was also strategic and psychological. This is where the deeper significance of Midway becomes clear. Battles are remembered not only because of what was destroyed, but because of what became impossible afterward. Before Midway, Japan could imagine further decisive offensives built on naval air superiority. After Midway, those possibilities narrowed. The balance had not flipped in one dramatic cinematic gesture, but the direction of the Pacific War had changed. America had not merely survived, it had inflicted a wound that reached into the future, and the American side understood that future mattered. The United States had entered the battle with pressure of its own. Pearl Harbor still hung over everything. The Pacific still felt dangerous. American power was growing, but it was not yet overwhelming everywhere. Midway, therefore, became more than a tactical success. It became proof that Japan could be stopped, outplanned, and hit hard enough to lose initiative. That kind of proof matters in war. It shapes confidence. It strengthens resolve. It changes what commanders, soldiers, and entire nations believe is possible. For Japan, the opposite effect took hold. A battle intended to confirm control instead exposed vulnerability. A carefully constructed operation had failed under pressure, and not because the enemy was stronger in every visible way, but because information, timing, and reaction had gone badly wrong. That is one of the cruelest realities of war. An army or fleet can look powerful right up until the moment the system holding it together begins to crack. Midway became that crack. The loss was not just counted in steel and fire, it was counted in initiative. Japan could still fight fiercely after Midway, and it did. But from that point forward, it was increasingly fighting a war that demanded recovery rather than expansion. It had fewer tools for decisive attack, fewer elite resources to spend freely, less margin for error. The empire that had seemed unstoppable was now confronting the consequences of one failed gamble. And that is why Midway remains one of the most important turning points of World War II. It was the moment when confidence met preparation, when surprise failed, and when a rising empire discovered that momentum could be broken. Japan believed it was drawing the Americans into a trap. In reality, it was sailing toward a battle the Americans were ready to fight. They thought Midway would strengthen their control of the Pacific. Instead, it helped begin the end of it. That is the moment Japan realized the war would never be the same again.